So today we're doing the second Getting into the Weeds session. And so the theme for Getting into the Weeds this year is farming in a tight year. So today we're looking at nutrient efficiency, good for the bottom line, good for the environment with Keith Reed. And if it's going to let me go there. So some Zoom housekeeping things. So all participants will have their audio and video turned off during the webinar. If you would like to ask questions, please use the question and answer and chat features at the bottom of your screen. And questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Please keep an eye on the chat function as some links will be posted there for pesticide points, etc. And we are recording this webinar and the video will be shared later. So this is the second session of the 4 sessions of the Getting into the Weeds seminar, hosted by the Agri-Services team at Perennia. And so, not sure why it's not letting me see my notes here. But yeah, so you can get CCA, CEU, and pesticide points, so 1 point for this session. And to get credit for this session, each participant needs to watch it on their own device. Link will be posted in the chat to go to a survey for you to fill out your name and pesticide number to get credit for this session. You must print the screen and submit it when you apply to renew your certification. If you can't figure out the survey or need any assistance, please don't hesitate to contact me or any other Perennia specialists. So without further ado, I'll introduce Keith Reed. And so he's a retired soil scientist, is now a technical writer for the On-Farm Climate Action Fund with Perennia. His work focused on keeping nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, on the land so they can be used effectively and out of the water or air where they can be pollutants. So everything that Keith does is in the context of maintaining a productive and profitable agriculture system. So today is going to be talking about using fertilizer as one of the biggest crop production expenses on most farms. However, but with proper management, we can maximize our return to that expense and keep those nutrients on farm. So without further ado, I will introduce Keith and let him share his screen so he can talk to you guys about nutrient use efficiency.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Caitlin. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. See if I can get my screen shared here. Actually, go to okay. For some reason, it's not wanting to go to slideshow. There we go. Okay, are you seeing my slideshow or are you seeing my preview screen?
We are seeing your slideshow, but we can see the next slide as well, so we can see.
Okay,
your notes.
so it's gone to the wrong screen. Okay, let's.
No, if you can just exit out and try again.
Okay, here we go. Stop share. Share screen. There we go. That should be the right one now.
Yes, yeah, that looks great.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Looking forward to lots of questions and lots of discussion. But yeah, talk a bit about nutrient efficiency and how that can both save money for your clients and be good for the environment as well. And we go the right direction. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit about what nutrient efficiency is, and then how to improve nitrogen use efficiency, phosphorus use efficiency, touch a little bit on some of the other nutrients, and then discuss what the barriers we have to face on improving nutrient efficiency are, and then putting it all together, finish up talking about systems for optimizing nutrient use efficiency, how we can actually practically on the ground make a difference with nutrient use efficiency. Nutrient efficiency, it's a pretty simple concept. It's the nutrient output divided by the nutrient input. You think, drive a car, you drive a pickup truck, we're used to talking about miles per gallon. That's a measure of the efficiency of fuel use in the vehicle. This is the same thing. We're looking at the efficiency of the nutrient use by the crop. The trouble is there's all kinds of different ways that inputs and outputs are measured. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about all of them, but I want you to be aware that if somebody is throwing out numbers, you have to look at what inputs and what outputs they are actually using as their definition for nutrient efficiency. For fertilizer, as an input, it's pretty straightforward. We assume it to be 100% available. If you're talking about efficiency from a manure or a compost or an organic source, it's not going to be 100% available. So it depends if somebody is using the total nutrient or the available nutrient as part of the equation. The other thing is whether the input from the soil is included in the equation or not, because that will make a huge difference in what the numbers are. On the output side, usually we're using the harvested portion, but you do get times when somebody will have a number for the total plant. And that makes a big difference whether we're just talking about what we harvest or what actually the total uptake is by the plant. Usually what we harvest is about 50% of the total uptake. So that can change the number from 50% to 100% pretty quickly, just because you've changed the number you're actually using in the equation. The other way of looking at it is not the total nutrient uptake, but the increase in nutrient uptake. So the difference between a fertilized and an unfertilized crop. We can argue that's a more accurate way of measuring how well the nutrients being used, but we don't usually have those numbers unless it's a research plot. And then we look at whether the change in the storage in the soil is included or not. Then, a final bit of complexity is if you're a plant physiologist, you look at the efficiency within the plant. So they don't care really about how much is applied. They look at how much is taken up by the plant and how much of that is converted to yield. So you may see that expressed as nutrient efficiency, but that's a very different number than comparing fertilizer applied to fertilizer in the harvested part of the crop. It helps to understand that every nutrient has a nutrient cycle. We have what's in the soil taken up by the crop. Part of what's taken up by the crop is removed in the harvested part. Part is removed or returned back to the topsoil in the crop residues. There are some losses in the system through surface runoff, through leaching. And then if we add fertilizer, that's going to increase the soluble fertilizer, the soluble nutrients in the soil, and that will interact with a pool of slowly soluble nutrients. There's always that interaction back and forth between what's stored in a slowly available form, what's readily available for uptake by the crop. And some of that will move downward from the topsoil into the subsoil. Deep-rooted crops will pull some of that back from the subsoil up to the topsoil. So that's a generalized nutrient cycle. Just the way things move through the system and how those pools will change over time. Nitrogen, it's the biggest single expense in a lot of cropping systems. And it's challenging because it's slippery. It keeps changing back and forth between different forms. And all of those transformations are mediated by soil microorganisms. The life in the soil is really what's driving the changes between the different forms. Most of the plant uptake is in the nitrate form. It's because it's negatively charged, it will move with soil water, which means it can be easily moved to the plant as the plant takes up water from the soil, but it's also the most subject to losses from the soil. We can lose it through denitrification, we can lose it through leaching, or it can be converted back to organic nitrogen in the soil. Ammonium nitrogen on the soil surface can be lost to volatilization. If you apply urea or you apply manure, we can lose some of that to the air as ammonia. Organic nitrogen is the biggest amount of nitrogen in the soil. It has to be mineralized, converted to ammonium and then to nitrate before plants take it up. But the amount of mineralization is variable depending on temperature and moisture. If it's too cold, mineralization is going to be slow. If it's too dry, mineralization is going to be slow. So that means what would normally come from the soil or come from legume residues or added manure might not meet what the crop needs just because weather conditions are wrong. And the final point here is if there's mineral nitrogen in the soil that isn't used by plants, it's vulnerable to loss. So we want to try to keep the mineral nitrogen in the soil aligned with what the crop needs at a particular time. This is the diagram of the nitrogen cycle. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in the nitrogen cycle. I could generally spend an hour just talking about this, and that's not really what you signed up for today. But I think it's important to get a sense of the complexity of what does happen where you've got organic forms in the soil, mineralizes to ammonium. Some of that goes back to the organic form. Bacteria and fungi in the soil can use that mineral nitrogen, convert it back to the organic form. Plants have nitrogen in the mineral form to take it up. So this mineralization phase is incredibly important. It goes to ammonium, then to nitrate, and then to the plant. Plants can use ammonium, but trouble is it sticks to the soil, so it doesn't move as quickly to the plant roots as nitrate does. And then we talked about nitrate being vulnerable to leaching and also to denitrification, either to nitrous oxide or N2 gas. What we're trying to do is maximize what gets into the crop, what's harvested, and minimize what's lost to volatilization, to denitrification, to surface runoff, to get the best use out of our investment in purchased nitrogen. What happens if we don't do a good job? First thing is we're wasting money. It's an expense we don't have to have. If we can increase nitrogen use efficiency by 10%, at current fertilizer prices, that's like getting $20 an acre more nitrogen to the crop. If we could increase by 20%, that's $40 an acre. It starts to add up really quickly. And you can think about poor nitrogen use efficiency as being wasted money that we don't need to spend. There's also water quality impairment. If we have nitrate runoff into marine environments, that can trigger harmful algal blooms. That can lead to dead zones. The hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, you may have heard about that in the farm press. That's a result of nitrate coming down the Mississippi. If farmers can reduce nitrate losses, that's going to reduce the size of those dead zones. And more locally, those algae blooms could be what we call red tides that would be harmful to the shellfish industry. So there's certainly interest in reducing surface runoff of nitrate. And then nitrate leaching into groundwater can harm the drinking water quality. There's limits to how much nitrate can be in the water that we pump out of our wells. There's also air quality impairment. Ammonia in the atmosphere can lead to white haze. This is a big issue in British Columbia, where you've got the Fraser Valley. Lots of ammonia from the dairy and the poultry industry there combines with the sulfates from car exhaust from Vancouver. And the result is the mountains pretty much disappear in the summer from the white haze. And that's also an issue as far as air quality and breathing difficulties for some people. And finally, nitrous oxide from denitrification is a potent greenhouse gas. So if we can reduce that, we're contributing to reducing climate change. Okay, so how do we improve nitrogen use efficiency? What options are out there? First thing, and probably the toughest one, is to match the nitrogen, or sorry, not the toughest one, this is one of the easy ones, match the nitrogen supply to the time when crops need it. One of the problematic areas is fall manure applications. I know there's a lot of livestock farmers don't have storage to allow them to keep all of the manure till spring. They need to put some in late summer or fall. If you're going to apply in the fall, later is actually better as far as nitrogen retention, because you can more of that ammonium will stay in the ammonium form and stick to the soil rather than converting to nitrate in the fall. If it converts to nitrate in the fall, you can lose it through the winter. The form of the manure makes a difference too. If it's a solid beef manure or solid dairy manure, fall manure application can actually allow more of that organic nitrogen to mineralize in time for the crop to use it the next spring, where a spring application may actually mineralize after the crop has finished taking up nitrogen for the year. For fertilizer, split applications, using a starter nitrogen application and then coming back with a side dress or a top dress application, puts that nitrogen at the time when the crop is ready to take it up, ready to use it. Most of the nitrogen uptake by the crop is during the time of rapid vegetative growth. So for corn, that's sort of that knee-high to tasseling time. For cereals, that's that stem elongation. And that can be quite a bit later than planting time. Now, we don't always get weather that causes losses between planting time and side dress, so it doesn't always show up as being an economic advantage. But if we're going to look at risk of reducing risk of nitrogen loss and improving efficiency, trying to get more in a side dress or top dress application will improve efficiency. And then the final option is to use an enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizer, a coated fertilizer like ESN, or something with a urease and a nitrification inhibitor that delays the release of the nitrogen. Again, gets the mineral nitrogen at the time when the crop is ready to use it, ready to take it up. Okay. Second thing is, if we can keep that nitrogen in the soil by avoiding ammonia volatilization through placement, we're going to increase efficiency. If you apply urea on the soil surface, or you apply a liquid manure or a broiler manure on the surface of the soil, that ammonium that's released can be lost to the air, and that can be a significant part of the nitrogen we apply. It's not unusual with surface applied urea to lose 20 to 40% of the nitrogen if conditions aren't ideal. If we place that below the surface, that will almost eliminate that risk of ammonia volatilization. So we can do that by banding, but that needs to be balanced with crop safety. Urea or ammonia near the seed can cause a lot of root damage. So you have to balance how much you can put in a band and how close you can be to the seed row without causing crop injury. So it's not always an option with high nitrogen rates. We can broadcast and then incorporate, and that will, again, keep that ammonium in the soil. Ammonium in the soil will actually bind to the soil cation exchange complex, so it's pretty much protected from loss. The other point, you may have heard that acid soils reduce ammonia loss because it keeps it in the ammonium form, and that's true to a point. But if we're surface applying urea, as that urea granule dissolves and releases the ammonium within that granule, that moisture right around it, that release of ammonium actually pushes up the pH and pushes the reaction from ammonium to ammonia. So acid soils are very good at reducing losses of stuff that's in the soil. Urea sitting on the surface, it's going to make a little bit of difference, but not very much. So don't think you're getting away with not incorporating just because you have acidic soils. And then the toughest one, but probably the one that has the biggest impact, is to match the rate of nitrogen applied to what the crop needs. And there's challenges here because what the crop needs year to year is going to change depending on yield potential. What the soil is going to supply is going to vary year to year, and what's the rate of release from any added organic amendments is going to vary from year to year. This is a diagram of looking at net response to added nutrients. We're talking about nitrogen here, but the concepts hold for pretty much every fertilizer. If you notice, we've got the y-axis here in dollars per acre. So that's yield times value to give you, okay, how much yield are we getting? And also puts fertilizer expense or fertilizer cost on the same axis. So as we add fertilizer, yield goes up, but we have the law of diminishing returns. The first yield increments are bigger than the later ones, and as you get close to maximum yield, you will get essentially very little and then no additional yield from added fertilizer. And eventually, if you keep adding more and more fertilizer, there'll be a point where yields will drop off. In the case of cereals, this would be where you've pushed the crop too far and it lodges. So, yields go down because the crop's flat on the ground, and either you've broken the stems and those heads don't fill, or they're there but you can't harvest them because they're laying flat on the ground. We know we want to avoid this. This is the area where we're into insurance applications. Well, I want to add just in case. If we get a good year, I'll get paid back. And it makes rational economic sense. If we actually are going to get that good year, but we don't get those good years nearly as often as we would like. Thing is, as we add more fertilizer, yield stops increasing, expense keeps going up. So our maximum net return, best return in terms of dollars spent on fertilizer, is at a lower fertilizer rate than where we get our maximum yield. There's some bushels there that we don't get enough extra bushels to pay for the cost of the fertilizer. And as we add more of those insurance applications, our yield goes, or our return goes down. So if we can get as close as possible to this maximum net return area, that's where we're going to get the greatest nutrient use efficiency. Good news is, there's a range here where we're pretty close to the maximum net return. Economically, we don't have to hit that bang on, but we want to be close. So tools to target optimum nitrogen rates. First one is make sure we're accounting for all the sources of applied nitrogen. If we've applied manure, if we've applied compost or biosolids, account for the manure account for the nitrogen that's in that. If there were previous legume crops, so if you plowed down a forage legume, that can leave significant nitrogen behind in the soil. to the point where a crop of corn or a crop of wheat or barley may not need any fertilizer nitrogen at all to maximize yields if you've plowed down a good stand of forage legumes. Cover crops, legume cover crops are significant, but not as much as a perennial forage legume. Grain legumes, soybeans, edible beans, don't actually leave a lot of nitrogen behind. They take most of the nitrogen they fix out of the air and export it in the grain. The difference with a grain legume, though, is something like soybeans leaves very little residue in the soil to tie up nitrogen. So if you compare planting after soybeans to planting after grain corn, to the amount of carbon that's left behind that can tie up the nitrogen in the soil, the soybeans have a lot less residue there. So it looks like you're getting a credit. It's just you're not tying up the nitrogen that the grain corn does. Soil tests, can we soil test for nitrogen? Again, I talked about nitrogen being slippery. It keeps changing. It keeps moving around. So if you do a soil test for nitrate, it will give you a snapshot of what's in the soil right now, but that's going to be different than what's in the soil 3 weeks from now. The other thing is there haven't been a lot of calibrations for Atlantic Canada, so it's questionable. We do know, if you take a nitrate soil test, it shows you've got enough there to feed the crop. You don't need to add more fertilizer. We don't need a lot of calibration there to know that if you've got lots, you don't need to add more. You're not going to get paid to add more. It's where we're in the moderate range. We don't know exactly what that means. So it's a tool, but it's a tool to be used with some caution. Strip trials, it's a great way to test how well you're doing. Do a zero nitrogen strip, or even do a strip where you say, okay, I will drop my nitrogen rate by 20% or 25%. See how much difference that makes in the yield. When you've got a yield monitor on the combine, makes it easy to do that. But you want to do multiple reps. It's not going to be, okay, I'll do one strip and that's going to tell me everything I need to know. Things can change across the field, so you want to do multiple strips to get a reliable answer. And then optical sensors, the Green Seeker, they're a promising technology, but it depends on what calibration has been used for the instrument. And it depends where that calibration was done. A lot of the sensors were developed in the prairie provinces. You'll get calibrations that say, oh, yeah, it actually says if you could look at the calibration, it would say, oh, the greener the crop, the more nitrogen, because they're calibrated for an environment where moisture is limiting. And it means if you've got good moisture, you've got lots of biomass, you've got more yield potential, you can justify more nitrogen. In Atlantic Canada and in Ontario and Quebec, it's the opposite. So you actually get answers from the calibration of the sensor that don't make sense for our environment. You really need to be careful about that and ask some tough questions. I think there's potential, but there's questions there as well. Okay, moving on to phosphorus. Second biggest cost on most farms is, and second biggest factor as far as crop yield response. The phosphorus supply to the plants is dictated by what's tied up in the soil. So the soluble ion that's taken up by plants is phosphate, PO4, and it is very reactive. It binds to clay, it binds to soil minerals, and it forms insoluble compounds with calcium in alkaline soils, or with aluminum and iron in acidic soils. And those compounds with aluminum and iron are actually more insoluble than the calcium phosphates. So if you look at availability from the soil, that's going to be highest at a pH of somewhere around neutral or just below, so 6.5 to 7 pH. And if you've got an acidic soil, it's going to be bound very strongly. If you've got a highly acidic soil, you may want to consider adding some lime as much to increase phosphorus availability as anything else. The amount of organic phosphorus doesn't appear to change much with added phosphorus fertilizer. Most of that added P ends up in the mineral forms. Unlike nitrogen, soil testing is a very reliable indicator of what's available to plants from the soil. The caution here is that the amount extracted varies with the P test. So make sure you're using fertilizer tables that match the test used by the lab. So if you look at testing any soil with different tests, different extractants, Malic 3 is going to give you a higher number than Bray, a little bit higher, equal or higher, which are going to be higher than what comes from the Olsen or the sodium bicarbonate extraction, which is going to be much, much higher than what's coming out of the Morgan test. Morgan is what's used in New York State. So if you decide you're going to go to the tables from New York State for fertilizer, and they're based on a Morgan test, you're going to be under fertilizing because your numbers are way off. Or same thing, if you send a test to the States and get a Morgan result and use them on a fertilizer table designed for Malic 3, you're going to be under or over fertilizing because the numbers are actually much lower than they should be. So just be aware of that when you get a soil test result. Phosphorus changes forms in the soil, and if you look at the width of the wedge here being the amount in the soil, what's in the soil solution, what's directly available to plants is much, much less than what's tied up in stable or insoluble forms. So if we add fertilizer, we add manure, it's going to go into the soil solution. Some of it's going to go into organic forms, some of it's going to go into mineral forms, but we tend to have this slow transformation that moves from soluble forms into less soluble forms. And then if we deplete what's in the soil solution, some of that will move back, but what moves back tends to be slower than what's being converted into insoluble forms. Soil test P, we're trying to predict what's plant available P. As I said, depending on the soil test, the width of this bar will vary. It relates to plant available P, but it's not an exact one-to-one correlation. So if we're going to improve P use efficiency, and the background here, these are actually phosphorus deficient corn plants, but they're phosphorus deficient because they're in a very compacted soil, not necessarily because there wasn't enough fertilizer P applied. You have to watch out for what's actually causing the issue. So first thing is base the rates on soil tests. If there's already enough in the soil, adding more won't increase yield. Adding fertilizer just to meet a yield target is not going to gain you much if you've already got a lot in the soil. Subsurface banding. If we can put the fertilizer in a band near the seed, it's going to be available when that plant has a small root system. And phosphorus, the plant actually needs phosphorus early in the growth stage, especially the grass crops, cereals and corn. If we band, we protect that phosphorus from loss, so it's not going to run off the surface, as well as putting it in a concentrated form that's more available to the roots. There's less exposure to the soil. I talked about those transformations from soluble to insoluble forms. If you put it in a band, you've got less contact between the fertilizer and the soil, so you get a less tie-up or a slower tie-up, so it stays available longer. If we're banding with the seed, you need to watch safe rates. Phosphorus itself tends to be pretty safe, but we aren't applying just phosphorus, we're putting some nitrogen or some potash with that. Those ones can be harmful to the plant and cause some salt injury. So you do have to watch how much you band with the seed. If we go to a 2x2 band, and that's just saying, okay, it should be 2 inches to the side and 2 inches below the seed. So that means if the seed is at 2 inches depth, the fertilizer band should be at 4 inches, not at 2 inches. It's actually down below the seed. It will give you very good crop safety, and you've got the band located where the roots will grow, because the roots will tend to grow down at about a 45-degree angle. That's a very good compromise between the immediate availability of what's with the seed and the later availability of broadcast P, where the plant can't get at it until you've really developed a large root system. And I talked about, corn especially needing enough phosphorus early on. The maximum size of a cob of corn is set at about the 5-leaf stage of a corn plant. That's when the cob is initiated. If the plant is deficient in phosphorus at that stage in its growth, it will limit the size of the cob. And even if there's lots of phosphorus later in the season, the plant, will never make up for that. So that's why we see that starter response in corn. We see a starter response in wheat. We don't necessarily see that starter response with a crop like soybeans that don't use that phosphorus to set the grain fill or grain seed initiation until the flowering stage. Okay, there's differences between plants. And then if we're strip till, deep banding, you're going to get less response because it takes longer for the roots to get to that. And you may actually get more tie-up depending how the strip tiller works, because you're mixing that fertilizer with more soil. If we are doing a fertilizer band, including some ammonium nitrogen with the phosphorus will improve uptake, and the optimum there is about 1 part nitrogen to 4 parts phosphate. So if you think a lot of the, if you like conventional starter fertilizers, an 832-16 or a 624-24, or even monoammonium phosphate, an 1152-0 or 1248-0, it's at that 1-to-4 ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus. Nobody's actually figured out exactly why that works so well, but it has been shown to work very effectively. And then liming acid soils will increase that phosphorus availability. Other nutrients, this is actually soybeans showing potash deficiency. Potash deficiency, you get yellowing or chlorosis around the margins of the leaves. The center stays green and tends to be on the older leaves in the plant. Soybeans show that fairly readily. The cations, so potassium, calcium, magnesium, they're held in an exchangeable form. So use a soil test to ensure you've got adequate supply. Again, if you've got enough in the soil, adding more is not going to give you a benefit. If your soil is short on any of those, you will get an advantage. Calcium and magnesium tend to be deficient more often in acidic soils. And so rather than adding a calcium fertilizer, we're going to be liming to both add calcium and change the pH. There might be some advantage to potassium in a starter band for corn if soil K is low, but again, at low rates, because there is a risk of salt injury. Sulfur. Sulfur is mobile in the soil. It's there as the sulfate ion when it's taken up by plants, so that can leach out if we get excess moisture. But because it's mobile, it can be broadcast. So if we do need to add some sulfur, using ammonium sulfate, using gypsum or calcium sulfate, we'll provide sulfate directly to the plants. If you're going to use elemental sulfur, it needs to be applied far enough ahead that microbes in the soil can convert the sulfur to the sulfate form. So it's a long term, and it may be feeding next year's crops rather than this year's crops for using sulfate or sulfur instead of sulfate. The micronutrients, most are soluble in acidic soils, but if we get an alkaline soil, they're tied up. Most often deficiency is because it's bound up in the soil and not because of insufficient supply. There are cases where there just really isn't enough, but more often it's what I've seen anyway. It's been conditions that tie up the micronutrient because of either too much organic matter. Manganese is one that gets tied up in muck soils or high organic matter soils, or because you've got alkaline conditions. So that's actually one area where a lot of Atlantic Canada has an advantage, where most of the micronutrients are more soluble in the soil than some of the alkaline soils I deal with in Ontario. Because the issue is being bound in the soil, you get more efficiency from a foliar spray for a micronutrient than from soil applied, in most cases. Not always, but in most cases. The exception would be boron, which could be included in broadcast fertilizer, but watch out for rates. The line between not enough and too much boron is very narrow. And I get nervous when I see recommendations for banded boron, because I worry that there's going to be some crop injury if people are not really, really careful. Okay, so some of the barriers to improving efficiency: hardware, equipment. If you're going to buy equipment, you no longer automatically get fertilizer boxes included with the planter or the drill. It's an added option. You have to specify that it's there. It's getting better as we go to air seeders, and can get the air seeders with double boxes, one for fertilizer, one for seed. But the conventional seeders, you really need to think about adding on fertilizer application equipment, fertilizer banding equipment. If you do have fertilizer boxes, and this is why they've disappeared, is clean out at the end of the season. Planting season is critical. If you leave it and they rust, they don't work. And I know many farmers have cursed the fertilizer boxes just because they didn't do a good enough job of cleaning things out, and they seized and no longer work. The other thing is side dress equipment for row crops is not widely available. Not everyone has access to something that could side dress fertilizer into a standing crop. Another barrier is the fertilizer supply. If we're going to put everything on at planting or shortly after, it's challenging to get delivery exactly when you need it. Everybody wants the fertilizer delivery at the same time, and that's a challenge for farmers. It's a challenge for fertilizer companies. And time. It's extra time to fill the planter, and it moves more field activities to a busy planting season. Or if you happen to be a dairy farmer, side dress nitrogen on corn conflicts directly with haying time. And if I was a dairy farmer, I know which would win. So it's always a matter of balancing. Okay, where am I going to invest my time? What's going to give me the best benefit, and plan accordingly. And then the final barrier is just knowledge. If we don't know what the best thing to do is, we can't act on it. And that's where I'm happy to see as many people as are here today to learn, and where sessions like this are important. So putting a system together, start with the soil test. Make sure you've got pH, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, some of the micros. Not every micro test is reliable, but If they are reliable, make sure you've got it. Assess all your existing nutrient sources. So whether you've applied manure, whether you've got a previous legume crop, lime if needed. If the soil pH is very low and you need to apply lime, it can be 18 months from the time you apply lime until you get the full effect. It's not something that's going to happen right away, so you have to plan ahead. Think about upgrading equipment to allow for fertilizer banding. If you haven't got that capacity, think about adding that in. And then plan your nutrient applications to maximize efficiency. So we're going to follow the 4 R's, the right product at the right rate, right time, and right place. Check with your fertilizer supplier to make sure that you can get product supply. If they're going to be short on something in the spring, having it in place early is going to be important. Ideally, band all the phosphorus at planting with some nitrogen and phosphorus, and then broadcast some of the nitrogen and K. Put the phosphorus or potassium on all pre-plant. Follow up with a nitrogen top dress or side dress. For some situations, it may be that we're broadcasting all of the nitrogen and potash pre-plant. Again, balancing time and nutrient efficiency, and then balancing split application benefit with the time and the cost to implement. Think about it. Think about where it's going to fit in your system, and if it does make sense, make sure you do it. With that, thanks for your attention, and look forward to questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Keith. Yeah, so we'll get to some questions. So I see some questions coming in the question and answer box. So if anybody has any additional questions, make sure to put them in there. Or if we have time at the end, we can see if there's any raised hands. I just do want to clarify one thing. There are no pesticide points available for this talk, but there are CCA and CEU points. And I will put the QR code up to collect those once we're done answering questions. So I'll just start with the questions that have come in. So the first one is from Lee, and they say, I have heard of BNA testing in regards to nitrogen testing. Can you comment on the effectiveness and best practices of that?
Sorry, which testing is that?
So BNA, so I believe that's biological
nitrogen availability.
Nitrogen availability, yeah.
Okay, and that would be a matter of estimating from soil organic matter how much is going to be mineralized or available to the crop in the season. A couple of downsides to that. One is you're assuming a constant availability of or a constant mineralization rate from the nitrogen in the soil, which we know is going to vary year to year. The other thing is I would tend to look at an ideal system being one where what's mineralized from soil organic matter goes into supporting the growth of the crop and supporting the part that's returned back to the soil and becomes part of the organic matter again. If we are depending on mining a lot of the organic N from the soil, we're going to deplete organic matter in the soil. Yeah, and the other thing is we just haven't got calibration to say that it works any better than soil nitrate tests. I know there's one particular lab offers that estimate of biological nitrogen availability. It's not backed up with a lot of research that says when we look at what gives us information about optimum nitrogen rates, it doesn't give us any better answers, and actually not as good answers as looking at how much nitrate is available in the soil. Okay, again, information, but use with caution.
So the second question we have here is, you mentioned that phosphorus deficiency was showing up because the soil was compacted. Could you explain why?
Okay, that was a case where, yeah, this corn crop was planted when the soil was wet. The side of the slot was just smeared shut, and so the roots could not get out of the soil slot. The roots could not access the fertilizer that was in the soil, or access the nutrients that was in the soil. So one of the causes of nutrient deficiency is a small, tiny root system. So I should have mentioned, make sure you take care of your soil structure. So in that case, the fertilizer was there, plant couldn't get to it.
Awesome. Okay, next question here. Sometimes you see reference to ideal ratios of potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Can you speak to whether balancing these ratios is a good practice?
Bit of the history of where that came from. This is new science out of the 1940s. On the Atlantic coastal plain soils, where they actually started out. It was starting out with an acidic, infertile soil, and it went in terms of, okay, what are the limiting factors? We'll correct those, and then see where we end up. So it was acidic, so they added calcitic lime, and then there was potassium deficiency, and they added potassium fertilizer until that was corrected. And then it was magnesium deficiency, and they added magnesium until the magnesium deficiency was corrected. And then they tested the soil and said, oh, we've got 70% calcium and 15% magnesium and 3% potassium, and so we must need that ratio of nutrients to meet the needs of the crop. Trouble is, as they did further work, they found as long as you had enough calcium, magnesium, and potassium, that the crop wasn't deficient. It didn't matter what the ratios were. So trying to balance the soil to meet those ratios is spending a whole lot of money and wasting a whole lot of time for no benefit. Use the soil test to say, do I have enough calcium, or sorry, do I have enough magnesium? Do I have enough potassium? Do I have adequate pH? And if I have adequate pH, I generally have enough calcium, because the amount of calcium taken up by a plant isn't that large compared to what's usually in the soil for calcium. So no, the ratios will look wonky if our nutrients are deficient. But what we are measuring is whether the nutrients are deficient or not whether the ratio is important.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, next question. Can you please explain again why we in Atlantic Canada might get the opposite results from the optical sensors developed from the prairies?
Okay, so if you look at a crop of spring wheat growing in the prairies, the big driver to wheat yields in the prairies is moisture. They go by stored soil moisture, what's left over from winter precipitation, early spring precipitation, because they don't generally get enough rainfall during the summer to support the crop. So if you've got lots of stored soil moisture in the prairies, you get vigorous growth of the crop. If you're starting out dry, the crop will be less vigorous and therefore less green. And the green seeker in particular is better at picking up the amount of biomass that's there than the actual greenness of the crop. Just the wavelengths it measures. So if you're trying to decide how much fertilizer to put on your spring wheat or your spring barley in Saskatchewan, you're going to look at how much crop growth is there. If I've got good growth because I've got good moisture, it will respond to the nitrogen. I can put more nitrogen on. And so if you calibrate your green seeker to crop response, it's going to say more green, more fertilizer, more profit. If we come to Atlantic Canada, we generally start out with lots of moisture in the soil. The challenge is getting the soil dry enough to plant in the spring. And then there's good moisture during the growing season. So we don't grow crops based on stored soil moisture. We grow crops based on, having a supply during the growing season that's going to of water during the growing season. So we're trying to measure with an optical sensor whether there's a deficiency in chlorophyll because there's not enough nitrogen in the crop. So in that case, it would be less green means we're probably short of nitrogen. We're not short of we've got the biomass. We've got the moisture to support the biomass. So less green would mean I need more moisture, or sorry, need more nitrogen. If you've got a calibration that's saying more green means more nitrogen because I've got more biomass in a dry environment, it will give the wrong answer where you've already got enough moisture and it's a nitrogen deficiency because you're showing up as less green in the crop. It's important the calibrations be done for the environment. And the downside to large companies is you tend to have one set of calibrations that get applied where they shouldn't be. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask some tough questions of somebody selling an optical sensor and say, where was the calibration done? Can you show me some data that's relevant to my environment?
Okay. Great, thank you. We have time for a couple more questions, I think. So going back to what you were talking about manure, so for solid manure, is application in the fall or okay, or should you consider other application timings?
Yeah, for a solid beef manure, solid dairy manure, application in the fall should be okay. I would want to go later rather than earlier, but it will give that time for that mineralization to happen in the early spring. So fall manure, fall solid manure incorporated. Certainly in Ontario, trials directly comparing fall manure to spring manure. We got better nitrogen availability from the solid manure in the fall and better nitrogen availability from the liquid manure in the spring. Because more of the nitrogen in the liquid manure is already in the ammonium form.
Great. So we have 2 more minutes. I'll put the last slide back up. But the next question is for blueberries. They tend to have a lot of crop residue and organic matter, land not tilled, and a low pH. Are leaf tissues better than soil tests, or any particular suggestions for this type of crop?
Yeah, blueberries, tree fruits, any of those woody perennial crops, you're probably better to use tissue tests or PDO tests rather than soil tests, just to give you a sense, particularly for nitrogen, of what the status of the crop is. And with blueberries, I know there's a tendency to use a fairly high carbon mulch. So it's are you getting the balance between available mineral nitrogen and what's tied up with the the woody mulch that's used under the blueberry plants, and that's your plant's going to be the better indicator than a soil test.
Okay, great. So next, I think we have time for one more question. So the next question is, does the soil test show available P or total P? Total phosphorus, sorry. If it is available, and if it says I have high levels, should I be applying more for the crop at any time and under any circumstance?
Yep. Yeah. So what the soil test is going to show is available P. it's the part of the phosphorus that's in the soil that's actually potentially available to the crop, or that relates to what the crop can absorb at any time. So if your soil test says you've got very high levels of available phosphorus in your soil, adding more phosphorus is just going to get tied up in the soil. You're not going to increase what gets to the crop. There rare exceptions would be where you've got cool, wet springs. You may get response to a starter, a very low rate of starter P close to the seed, but that may be more visual response. You get a plant that looks better at the 4-leaf stage than a plant without fertilizer, but it may not yield anymore at the end of the year. And that's pretty common with a lot of the seed applied fertilizers is, the seedlings look more vigorous. Doesn't always translate to bushels at the end of the year unless, the soil is short of phosphorus.
Okay, so we are past 1 o'clock now. I know there are still some other questions that have come up. And so I can take those questions and we can send some responses if people want to send those questions to my email, which is listed below on the screen, if you can see that. I would like to thank Keith very much for coming and giving this talk. The QR code for CCA and CEU points is up in the top corner there. And if you want to join us, so it won't be, I guess, next Thursday, but on February 7th from 12 to 1 for the next Getting Into the Weeds session, which will focus on optimizing on-farm efficiency, labor, time, and equipment. Also, just a reminder, I posted the link to the after session survey in the chat. If people can take some time to answer that survey, that would be fantastic. And again, I would like to thank Keith for his time. And please, if anybody wants any more answers to questions, send me an email and I can pass them along to Keith.
Okay, yeah, it was my pleasure.
Thank you.